Good afternoon. Tonight we continue the series of lectures from colleagues from South America and Spain. Tonight we have a lecture by Nadia Fernandez de Pinedo and Maximiliano Camarda. Nadia Fernandez de Pinedo is professor of economic history in the Autonomous University of Madrid. She is a specialist in the history of Cuba, economic aspects and other aspects of history of Cuba in the 19th and 20th century. She has worked in the past in projects dealing with Atlantic and Pacific Ocean trade in the Spanish Empire. And she is also, of course, member of the project Port Arrivals Data, which we know these 2 months period are here for the winter or summer school, whatever, however you want to call it, because for Argentina it's summer, for us it's winter. And we took the chance to invite them to this series of lectures. Maximiliano Camarda is also professor of history in the University of Entre Rios, Paraná, Argentina. And he deals, among his interests, with trade and navigation and shipping in the South Atlantic, in Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil and stuff, as well as in inland waters, in river navigation and trade in South America. And both of them, also Maximiliano Camarda, of course, is member of the project Port Arrivals Data, working on the port of Buenos Aires. And today they are going to talk about a relationship between Rio de la Plata and Cuba and about the tasajo trade, this salted meat that fed the slaves in the plantations of Cuba. But for more, I will give the floor to them to begin the lecture. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. So thank you very much, first of all, for being here tonight. You know, I'm sure you have better things to do than listening to us, so really appreciate it. And we want to thank also the Institute for allowing us to present this ongoing research, and especially to Apostolos Delis. So what we are going to present today, it's an ongoing research within the framework, as Apostolos has mentioned, of the Portada project, focus on tasajo, that means on jerked beef, and we will begin by clarifying, you know, what this commodity was, why it matters, and from there we will trade it, as tasajo formed part, as you know, of a wider international commercial circuits in the 19th century, linking the major ports, in this case, Buenos Aires and La Habana. Then we will move to key actors on what the circulation of tasajo reveals about provisioning systems, labor regimes, and market integration in the Atlantic world. So, check my audio. I don't know what is going on, but here, okay. Okay. First of all, what is tasajo and why, you know, it's an important staple? So, tasajo is basically a traditional beef preservation method. So, the meat is dehydrated by removing moisture through salting, which inhibits spoilage and allows storage for extended periods. So basically, tasajo is made by cutting the beef in strips and then sheets, salting it, and then drying it, typically in open air or sun, until it becomes highly dehydrated and can be kept for long periods without refrigeration. So you have the different stages. We are not going to talk about it, but just to let you know. So here are the steps, and as you can probably think, this tasajo has main advantage. Its main advantage is logistical. Why? Because it was drier than most of other preserved meats. It was lighter and more space efficient, could be shipped in bulk without the need of barrels, and kept for months, even in tropical climates. So it can be transported in large volumes, stored and distributed with limited losses. But there's a trade-off always. So the trade-off was a reduced nutritional quality, so a loss of some soluble proteins. And they need to soak on, often chop it to remove salt and rehydrated it before cooking. So what it was produced? It was mainly produced in the Rio de la Plata region, covering what are now northern Buenos Aires province, Entre Rios, Santa Fe, and Corrientes. But it was also produced in Venezuela, in Caracas, in Mexico, especially in Tampico. They were not the only place produced. At Paris Universal Exposition in 1867, the main producers presented samples. And in addition to Argentina, Confederation, Uruguay, Chile, Brazil, there was also United States and the British colony. At the exhibition, they were noted. Those from the United States are the finest, but prohibitively expensive. England, which comes in second place, is subject to the same criticism. This is not the case with the Argentinian Republic and Brazil, whose prices are moderate. So, the Rio de la Plata was the main supplier from Cuban demand, thanks to its abundant supply of small-sized cattle, which is spread freely due to the area's natural condition, that is, numerous streams, a temperate climate, and flat plains. For whom, basically, during the 17th and 18th century, it was used as a food for ship crews. Tasajo was an essential part of the diet of navy vessels and merchant ships. Often it was described as a sailor main staple. It provided an effective way to preserve meat in highly humid environments, allowing crews to consume protein for months. But from crews, it moved to enslaved workers on plantations in Brazil and in the Caribbean at the end of 18th century and during all the 19th century, especially on the island of Cuba. Yes? Okay, so there's a diverse variety of tasajo. In general, salted meat, it was referred as tasajo, charque, or charqui. Charqui, it's from the Quechua word charqui, which means precisely jerky, dried meat, salted and dried meat. So, in the Universal Exposition in Paris, in the sections devoted to dehydrated preserved, the variety consumed in Jamaica were explained, as you can see just there, these 4 varieties. But in different regions, it had various names based on origin and the cut, when you slice the cow, so depending on the cut, it has a different names. For example, in the case of Cuba, the tasajo imported from Buenos Aires was named tasajo en penca. The tasajo came in from North America, as it arrived in boxes, was called boxed tasajo. And they distinguish tasajo, very different ways, as tasajo brujo, which means witch tasajo, because they call it because it's expanded in size when cooked and could be found everywhere. The poor quality tasajo was named in Cuba tasajo rebenque and so on. So in Cuba, they produce also small quantities of tasajo from pork, and they call it tasajito, which means small tasajo. So we have very different types of tasajo, not very appealing, I have to say, very smelly, but it's an easy way to obtain proteins, easy to stock and transport. So, but why to focus on tasajo?
First, because it was part of Atlantic commercial circuits and was closely tied to the slave economy. Sugar plantation cannot survive without tasajo. Second, because despite some research on tasajo is that in addition to being scarce, it has tended to focus on only one aspect of the overall process. For example, early work in the production of salted meat tasajo by Alfredo Montoya in the 1917s and 1917 has recently been continued by Nicolas Biancardi, who was explored in great depth the origins of production and the production process itself. A similar pattern can be seen in studies of commercial traffic, such as Asdrúbal Silva books on the origin of the links between the Rio de la Plata and Cuba.
Okay, in the case of Cuba, in 19th century, Cuban history has been largely studied through basically, four main lenses. The most recent one brings environmental history and the history of science to the front. Then there's a second major line focused on nation and imperialism, how Cuban nation was forged through war, political projects and institutions, and of course independent wars. And the other two main lines of research linked with Cuban economic historiography has largely centered on the sugar plantation as a socioeconomic complex. So the focus on sugar has tended to overshadow other sectors and internal markets. Although this has been corrected during the last decades. But sugar has functioned as an organizing axis at the entire 19th century economy, and historians have analyzed labor, land, technology, trade, finance, state, and infrastructure through this commodity. So, however, despite this centrality of the enslaved labor within the plantation system, it has been studied mostly tasajo through explanations focus on the factors of productions, that means on slaves, but slaves primarily as a labor power with immigration-based perspectives and debates about white migration and the transition from the enslaved to the free labor, while receiving much far less attention as an economic subject, that is, as an active agent of demand and consumption. So it's really striking that there are very few studies on tasajo in Cuba. Even in the National Archives, you cannot find the sections on tasajo, despite its being an essential element in plantations and in the island's diet. So in order to dig deeper on this tasajo trade, we have selected some sources. As you can see there, key sources based for research and production consumption of tasajo basically include the salting plants, so the saladeros records, production register, but also harbor masters in the Capitanía de los Puertos, so the cargo manifest, inspections or port fees. We have also official reports from the administrative point of view, from sanitary point of view, military and fiscal reports that are really relevant. We can also study through the press, and especially on statistical compendia on trade that are really very valuable. So, let's focus on the two sides of the story. On one side, let's focus on demand, and then on the supply side. So to better understand the context, we are going to show you a basic timeline in the case of Cuba, just to understand a bit what happens in 19th century in the case of Cuba. So, the specialization in sugar production started basically at the end of 18th century and all along the 19th century, when the sugar reorganized the island economy and became a central axis of the production system. So this transition reinforced a dynamic of export specialization and dependence on foreign markets. So in this overview, you can see at different stages. So from transformation beginning at the end of the 18th century, boosted basically by several special events. At the beginning, it was the British occupation of Havana in 1762, and then we have the Bourbon reforms, which liberalized the Spanish trade with American colonies from 1765. Then there's another turning point, really important. It's the 1798 Haitian slave revolt, disrupting, as you know, the world sugar export, and marked a real inflection in Cuban economy, basically because it was combined with foreign free trade from 1818 that spurred really a rapid mill growth. Then all along the 19th century, between 1820 and 1869, what we see is a really growing transition because there's a big investment in land, labor, and factories, and where you see the manufacturing is upgrade, basically linked or really related to steam powers and also on railway. So at that point, in the middle of the 19th century, you can see that technical transitions where slavery and technology are combined or are compatible. So then comes the 10 years wars between 1868 and 1878, where there was some areas or producing sugar that was ravaged, and at the same time was of a really growing global competition from other sugar producers, but also, you know, a new staple, beet sugar. At the same time, there's another transition from legal and social changes, moving from slavery to, you know, the final abolition of slavery that will be completed in Cuba in 1886. So this situation, you know, forced that during the 80s and 90s, you know, before the Independence War, mills will evolve into very large modern mills called the centrales, with rails, port, you know, with a lot of investment in capital and kind supply chains. So then came the 1895-1888 war that was logically in disruption, and we will see, you know, another phase of a recovery, you know, in 1899 and in 1900. So in this evolution can be seen through different data. So the table shows that the slave trade intensified in the period, you know, opened, as I mentioned, you know, by the Haitian Revolution, then remained at high level and almost doubled during the 1810s, in line with the reforms and the expansion of sugar supply discussed above. So it largely shows likely as a result of the first abolition measures agreed between Great Britain and Spain in 1817. We could see like a small down, and then that was largely inefficient, as you know, basically this first abolition. And in the 30s, you know, the trade reached, you know, a record, nearly 200,000 people transported to Cuba. So slavery, as I mentioned, just will continue, you know, until the 1886, and especially will finish in the end, you know, during the Spanish-American War. There's a clear correlation between the import of slaves, enslaved people, and the growing of sugar production in Cuba. What you see here is that Cuba will become the major exporter of sugar worldwide, reaching 26% of world production in the 50s and in the 60s. As a consequence, you know, the agrarian economy and selected growth model focus population, commercial states, and infrastructure in the island's western half. So this dynamic split Cuba into two. So what we call the Cuba Grande, the big Cuba, the most prosperous, sugar-dominated in yellow then, with cane fields, and the Cuba Chica, little Cuba, you know, centered on a more diverse crops and livestock. In fact, Cuba produced fresh and local tasajo. The most reputed were from Cayo Romano and in the Isla de Pinos, in the Isles of Pine, but could not compete in prices with imported tasajo from Rio de la Plata. So from the perspective of consumption and material culture, it has a huge impact. So Cuba has heavily focused on sugar export because it has weak local manufacturing. That means that they needed, you know, for daily consumption, really dependent on imports. It won't be until the late 19th century, with the shift to free labor, that a rise on a more diversified mass consumption became, you know, more evident. Another important aspect is that the tariff policy was shaped by an agreement between the Cuban elites and the Spanish monopoly, aiming to secure the Cuban market for Spanish products, agricultural, but also manufactured products, initially by raising prices on foreign goods. So that leads to quite a lot of tensions with the sugar elite on one side, a higher cost for suppliers among island consumers, and there's a lot of frictions, and Spain was, you remember that Spain was not a big consumer of sugar. First, because it didn't play the same role as Great Britain in the re-export to other places in Europe, but also because we have a substitute, which is honey. So Spanish population, you know, was consuming sweets, but through honey, not necessarily to sugar. That's why you have a very different consumption pattern in all Europe. So the Cuban elite and the Spanish metropole finally reached an agreement, which was basically to favor exports on the island colonial product with significant tariff reductions in exchange for consuming, of course, the metropole production. So this impact on consumption means that there was a very clear structure, two types of consumptions in Cuba. One linked with white population, and the other linked with the enslaved. And that tasajo became a staple in Criollo cuisine because it was a cheap protein to sustain intensive plantation labor. According to the Ingenio rules on practical manuals that can find in 19th century, the slave diet placed tasajo in a minimum southern rations and often with salted cod as a backup. So in the 1844 reglamento, you could see that they could salted cod and tasajo were interchangeable items with a minimum rations. But if we move to, I'm going to put it in. If we move to the 60s, in the regularity text, we see that cod had totally disappeared, and it's only tasajo that it's maintained. So these data are consistent, or these regulations are consistent with the data. If you see here at the beginning, we see there's a tasajo and cod, and then you see there's a growing amount of tasajo over cod. So tasajo offer basically two vital traits for plantation feeding: low cost and high durability. So its textures and high salt content require prior preparation. That means you need to desalt it, to soak and chop. Sweet in centralized kitchens where planters could standardize rations from uniform stock, and that's a really advantage. So if we see basically the slave diet, you could see, summarized, in this table. The daily diet of enslaved populations rely on basically salted protein, approximately, 200 grams, paired with rice and other staples such as bananas, corn from or legumes. During the harvest season, la zafra, sugar products like the guarapo, if you want to become diabetic, for example, you need to have a shot of guarapo, which basically when you press the cane, the first juice of the cane, which contained all the sugar there, that was given to the slaves because it boosts you basically all the sugar. I don't think if it's necessary to recommend it or not, but it's quite an experience, I have to say. So, in many ingenios, in many sugar plantations, they encourage the slave to have a small plots, they call it conucos, on minor livestock, adding varieties and cutting costs. For example, bananas especially play a crucial role, not only as a regular food, because also as a material used in the ingenio operations. So, they try to combine. In the cattle areas we saw, in the map, like Santi Spiritu or Puerto Príncipe, some ingenios use fresh meat, fresh tasajo when it was, locally shipped. But even so, imported tasajo, often prove more costly effective than the local productions and depend basically on importations. So just to mention that tasajo wasn't exclusively to sugar slavery. It serves also as rations in major works. For example, we could see in the railway constructions in 1840, for example, in the railways Havana Guinness, when they were building it, the contract explicitly differentiate fresh meat for whites and tasajo for blacks. It not only reached, the slaves, but peasant and popular white sectors, integrating into everyday cuisine, as this example, as the famous ajiaco, which consists of a stew of broth with lemon juice, chili peppers, tasajo, pieces of banana, cassava, and campics, quite a mixture. So somehow tasajo, underscores this dichotomy, in the island. So if we go into the data, what we see there is that the main port for tasajo arrivals was, logically, La Habana. It received about 71% to 90% of all the tasajo entered Cuba between 1826 and 1859, based on the commercial balance data. Matanza was the second, followed by Trinidad and Cienfuegos. The main sugar, as the main sugar plantation, expanded, you will see that, the entrance diversify. So Based on the preliminary data, with gaps due to lack of data in 1888, 1883, and 84, 52% of the ships that arrived in Havana with tasajo between 1519 and the First World War came from Buenos Aires, and the 38% from Montevideo, mainly in brigs and frigates, interpretes, polacks. The steamships appear for the first time linked with the tasajo trade in 1861, and they will dominate the traffic from 1905 onwards. But just to stop the demand and then move to the supply side.
Having briefly explained the origin of demand, let's see what happened in the saladero where tasajo was produced. In 1781, the first salting plant was finding on the banks of the Colla stream, and the second in 1786 on the banks of the Miguelete stream. The first owned by Francisco Medina, and the second by Antonio Maciel. This and several others during this period were established on the coast of present-day Uruguay, on the coast of the River Plate, such as Colla, Maldonado, and in particular Montevideo during the last decades of the 18th century. As a result of the massive influx of the ships that demanded this food for their crews, it also began to be traded to Cuba and Brazil. Given the high demand in the following decades, the number of salting houses continued to increase, particularly in what is now Entre Rios, Colón, Gualeguaychú, and Gualeguay, which will become the ports of the aperture for much of the beef jerky produced in the region. As mentioned, the first stage of jerky production was small in volume until demand generated a change in the scale of production. A large number of salting plants were created, a large supply of input for production was required, particularly salt and regional specializations linked to think particular commodity development. From 1820 onwards, salting houses continued to expand, growing both in size and in the capital investment. The importance of salted meat in relation to leather grew gradually during the 19th century and was linked to technological improvement that were implemented in order to make better use of the animals. In particular, the use of arsenic for leather, steam engines, and the incorporation of horses and sheep allowed for an expansion of production. This system would survive for a century, from the establishment of the first salting houses to their conversion into corned beef production plants. In the graph, we can see how the increase in ships arriving at the Rio de la Plata led to an increase in the production of beef jerky to supply sailors. The beginning of trade with Cuba came about as a result of change in the internal regulation of the Spanish monarchy in the last decades of the 18th century, which allowed the entry of new merchants from another peninsular territories, particularly Basques and Catalans. The opening of most ports to Atlantic overseas trade and the circulation of new goods with very low on the taxes. 57 ships arrived in the Rio de la Plata from Cuba between 1786 and 1802 with constant traffic. The first stage up to 1784 saw a minimum of 4 ships and maximum of 11. With the conflict at the end of the century, there was an increase in American ships and consignees who would play a predominant role in the following decades. The English joined it that after. The Americans and the English controlled the beef jerky trade until the French and English blockade, which lasted until 1850. In this context, Spanish ships and local shipping agents returned. The following graph shows the impact of military conflict on the export of beef jerky from Buenos Aires. The consignee who participated in the process varied over time. During the last decades of the 18th century, there was a wave of immigration of Catalans and Basques who had connection with trade houses in those places and began to operate directly with them. José Ramón Milá de la Roca was a Catalan migrant who was born in San Sebastián de Guipúzcoa. His father was Catalan and his mother was Basque, of noble origin. Upon his arrival in the Rio de la Plata region, José Ramón Milá de la Roca began sending leather to the ports of Barcelona and Cádiz, probably in exchange for goods commissioned by him. Only 2 years after his arrival, he promoted the shipments of beef jerky and by to Havana, which had begun gradually. In 5 years, he sent 23 shipments. He also traded in slaves with his own ships and sent leather to Barcelona. Another case, starting with neutral ships in the conflict between Spain and England, American consignees began to trade, and from 1810 onwards, the English had the largest share of the traffic. This dynamic continued until the 1814s. Since the Revolution of Independence, a central player in overseas trade was John Zimmermann. Coming from a family of merchants, in 1808 he joined a German trading house in New York as an assistant. In 10 years, he began trafficking goods, particularly weapons of war, sugar, and various European products, like David Curtis de Forest, Guillermo Ford, among another. Given his origin and connection, his operations were based in Hamburg and US. He established trading houses with Patricio Lynch and later with Fraser, continuing to expanding his business, be incorporating new market and goods. In 1825, on behalf of Zimmermann, Fraser and Company, he purchased the Los Remedios Ranch, dedicated to sheep farming, promoting the migration of families from North Europe. He was heavily involved in diplomatic activities, and in 1829 was consul of Hamburg and Bremen in Buenos Aires. His commercial and family network is extended across different territories at the global and regional level. Between 1824 and 1835, he was the largest consignee of beef jerky, making 69 shipments to Cuba, 6 or 5 ships per year. Another case, following Argentina conflict with France and England during the 1814s, the 1816 saw a return of actors from Spain. They managed to continue trading with Cherokee to Cuba in the following decades. One example of this is the Lavallor family, who settled in the Rio de la Plata, Jaime Lavallor, at the end of the 18th century and participate in Buenos Aires Consulate of Commerce. In the 15th and 16th, they made an average of 15 shipments of beef jerky to Cuba per year. In 1868, they founded and presided over shipping company in Buenos Aires, called Company Italo-Platense de Navegación a Vapor, which began operating a year later and commissioned the construction of 3 passenger ships in English shipyard to transporting immigrants from Mediterranean ports to the Rio de la Plata.
In the case of the Havana, in order to find out who were the dried beef traders called tasajero, what we are using is the city directories. Basically, now I'm going to show you the directory from 1841 on the 1859. But our intention is to compile the list on their connections. All have their headquarters on streets near the port. And you can see it there. This is the Havana city. And the majority of these tasajeros were concentrated, close to the port. You can see, Obra Pía, Teniente Rey, Oficios, and Amargura, which are the main streets, dealing just onto the port. And that's where they were. It's logical because the tasajeros has the books coming with tasajo has some privileges. And for us, there was a lot of complaints because they were have a particular space in the canal, and there was not such a beast entering. The rest of the merchants were complaining if they allow them to enter, through, these canals, because even if it's a dried product, during the travels, it could be rancio, se vuelve rancio, how do you say? It could be like very smelly and had a lot of problems. Oh. So they would wanted to enter quickly, in the port, and then be be sold and so on. So the other source we are using is the Diario de la Marina, thanks to the Portada project. These are the consignees that appear mostly in the Diario de la Marina. The one that are recorded through the vessels entering La Habana, which we will explore further in the future. Some of these families, these family sagas, have already been studied, such as the Sama family by Martín Rodrigo y Alarillo. And for example, the Sama family developed a comprehensive business strategy in Cuba, typically of Havana merchant networks integrating the Atlantic trade, sugar complex provisioning, port services, credit on political family alliances, converting profits into social power, titles, and selective repatriation. In this example, it's from Pablo Sama y Pares, started in Havana, traded with general merchandises. You have there.
In la novela de True.
In Catalonia, yeah, of course. Repatriation? Okay. So he started, with the general business or general merchandise, evolved into the key plantation supplies, without never relied then on a single sector, and he focused basically on export system bottleneck, how to say. After 1831, the network expanded into sugar states and financial port dominance, and he started making alliance with one of the biggest, slavery and planter, with that, for example, Zulueta. So what we aim to do with basically this talk, it was to align all the aspects we wanted to explore, in greater depth, highlighting the relevance of the importance of the routes that link tasajo to the Caribbean sugar producing centers. It's primarily, not exclusively, destination, as you know, was enslaved people, and we understood, once you understood them, more as a consumer, beyond their role as a productive labor. So the trading houses and merchants we want to stop in debt that involved in this traffic generally sought to control the entire circuit, from Spain to the colonies or former colonies, avoiding bottlenecks in the production process, basically, and securing substantial profits. So these merchants normally diversified their business, adapting to the transformation that unfolded throughout the 19th century. And that's all, folks. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this fascinating journey between Rio de la Plata and Cuba. This trade of beef that feeded the infamous institution. I don't know if you have questions, commentaries. Here? Okay. Have you? No. No.
Yes.
Very interesting, your proposal, your presentation. There is another thing that it's important to say. It is a thing that we know for another sources, and we have so well documented with the labor that we make in the previous project in SEALIT, that is that this type of commodity is moved in a circuit that it comes from Barcelona or other places. He went to Mar del Plata, later they returned to Cuba, and from Cuba returned to Spain with another commodities like cotton, etc. No? And I think that it's very interesting to mark that that our present project Portada, it will be able to not only describe, to analyze this circuit in a full way, because we will know not only that we have 100, 700 of ships, we know the name of the ships, the name of the merchants, the name of the captains, and it will be possible to know, for example, this movement of tasajo, absolutely, and that in other cases, another important thing to say, that is one of the ways that Spanish merchants, Spanish captains, Spanish sailors participate in the slave system, because now there is a strong movement in order to mark the owners of the slaves in Cuba, for example, how there are lots of good families in Spain that they have their previous enrichment by the traffic of slaves. But there are another lot of people that they are not participate directly as owners of slaves, but their work was absolutely necessary in order to reproduce this system. And I think this thing is another question that we can study with our project. Thank you very much for this.
Lavaliol is the most important merchants, Barcelona, Buenos Aires. The connection, hace la conexión hacia Cuba, no sabemos de Cuba porque manda a Cuba, pero después los barcos retornan desde Barcelona. Entonces hace la conexión con Barcelona de projects.
Well, the names we saw of the merchants were mostly Catalan, if I understood well. I saw some Catalan names. So
Yes.
it explains why they had this connection with Barcelona and they were in this trade. Okay.
No, eso ya.
Okay.
Sí.
Thank you for the very fascinating presentation. I have to make two questions. The first one is about tasajo itself. What was the factor that made easy for the slave owners to give to their slaves meat, even if it's a byproduct, even if it's enforced by the law? Do we have any increase of cattle meat availability in this period, and they could give their slaves some kind of meat?
Yes, in fact, if they were close to the area where there was a lot of cattle, they could even feed them with local meat, but it's very expensive. It's only for white people. So it was, cheaper to import tasajo from Buenos Aires or even the States, depending on the time, than to feed, there's not enough cattle in Cuba to feed all the slaves. That was one of the main problems, one of the discussions, for example, in the Junta de Fomento, between the owner, the agricultural and the owners of the cattle and fighting, to try to provide. It's impossible, it's really difficult to find, to put un saladero, in Cuba because of the humidity. It's an island and it's a problem of the climate. So it's not feasible, only in a very few cases in different areas, to really, have fabrics of tasajo. So it's should be only, live tasajo, local tasajo, not possible. I mean, they need proteins. That's why at the beginning it's either salted cod, dominated by the British, the traffic, and then by the Spaniards, or it was any kind. It's not only tasajo. You have different types of like dried meat that was affordable for the slaves. That's why it's associated tasajo with the slaves on poor people in Cuba, basically. It's a way of having easy proteins, even if it looks like quite disgusting, I have to say. And it's very smelly. And for example, in the ports of Matanzas and La Habana, there's a lot of reports, even from Alexander von Humboldt. Well, the smell of the city is the smell of tasajo and salted cod, that it was totally insufferable for, foreign people, or, that it's in the report, and even in the report from the consulate, that it's totally associated with slaves.
Okay, thank you.
Not
Okay.
No.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering about salt, because you mentioned that they use salt for tasajo and so on, and probably they need big quantities of salt. I mean, this is the main commodity of the 19th century and earlier, of course. From where what was the source of the salt that they used?
La sal. It's very cheap because in Argentina, in the territory now is Argentina, have many places and have many salt. It's very cheap and es para el
sal marina.
sí, para hacer el peso de la, ¿cómo se llama? Para que se hunda el lastre.
Ballast.
It's more cheap because it's necessary for lastre. No, es en el centro de la Argentina. Inside. Many now many visitant tourists look
Tourist attraction.
big salinas. Sí. Salina Grande, Salina hay en Córdoba, en different.
Oh, these are interior, Córdoba.
Interior.
No, it's not.
From Asian oceans inside, so.
¿Cómo?
Peru also. I have some imports from Peru and even some from Spain. You could see, so there's an entire system, to feed the sugar plantation.
Es muy barata la sal y hay muchas vacas.
They have a lot of cows and it's very cheap.
It's very, yeah, a lot of cows and it's very cheap,
Yes.
this salt.
It's necessary también por el lastre, para
Yeah,
transportar
for
otros
the
productos.
ballast. They use it as ballast as well.
Entonces, esa es como la clave, digamos, que el lastre, para poder transportar las embarcaciones hacia otros lugares, necesitaban o cueros, o tasajo, o productos que sean muy pesados, que vayan en el fondo para poder...
Yeah, they use it like the British used it, sometimes for other ships they used coal. They used it alternatively as a cargo and as a ballast. But yes, they used the salt like this, alternative as a...
And come,
yes,
stones,
as a salt as a ballast, but also as a cargo, you know.
and come stones, another big product.
Like porcelains in China. They bring with porcelains, you know.
Claro.
Any other question? I've read in the bibliography about the life expectancy of slaves in the plantations. And we discussed this, but of course it's all new for me. About the sugar plantations, why life expectancy was much lower compared to tobacco or cotton or other plantations across the Americas?
First of all, because of the malaria. Even if the excuse of the doctors was that it's better to import, slaves from Africa because they, they don't get malaria. How to say it was the, reason, justifications. Yeah, because they are get used to. So it's not like, for example, when they try to favor the immigration from the Canaries, the majority of the Canarians just died because of the malaria. I mean, it was complicated. So malaria and the conditions, because even if the harvest of the sugar has to step, like the harvest itself to plant the cane and then the most chemical technical one, it was really, very stressful work because they needed to bring the cane in 24 hours into the mill. So it was really, really intensive. On all the records is that they were not in good conditions, even if you can see the ration of 200 grams per, normally in some cases there was complaints about only 1 meal per day, not 3 meals per day. So basically, they were not treated very well, basically. Even if, in the case of Cuba, it's the black population never surpassed the white one. It was the exception in the Caribbean. Because from the very beginning they were afraid of what happens in Haiti in 1781. So as they were afraid, they tried from the very beginning to try to control, to improve white migration with not very great success. That's why they changed Africans from coolies from China. So there's substitutions in the 70s, 80s, trying to improve the migration.
And the free color people you showed before in the diagram, did they work as well in the plantations, or they worked in other jobs?
Type of work, for example, near the ports, or they could be also in the Vegas or the tobacco fields, on coffee ones, on basically with the railway. They were working on the railway also. So
the plantations of coffee and tobacco didn't work with slaves?
It's a different type of structure, the plantation. I mean, and in different areas. So they were, but not, as much as you could find it in the sugar ones. It's a very different, intensive type of work.
¿Es posible poner acá, ponemos salar grande para que vea lo que es el salar? No, porque si no toma dimensión, si se puede poner. No, si pones salar grande en internet.
No, es que está conectado y no puedo buscarlo.
No es posible en internet.
Sí, no lo sé.
Para que vean el salar grande, para que si no tomas dimensión de. It's really big salt, all salt is many kilometers of salt.
No sé dónde está. I don't know how to do it, honestly.
Any other question, commentaries? Okay. If we don't have other questions, I don't know if you want to comment on anything else. Therefore, thank you very much for the presentation.